All right. Sarah Bierenbaum, thank you for being here today. It's good to
Thank
have
you
you
so
on.
much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me just give you a brief introduction for the audience so they get a feel for who you are and what you do and have done. You are a founder and a head coach of Nimble Penguin Coaching and Advisory Firm supporting founders, executives, emerging leaders. You have 20 years of leadership experience, including more than a decade in tech startups and 10 years as a professional stage manager. You bring a unique and diverse perspective to your work. You believe that empowered leaders drive innovative and build sustainable, successful companies, ultimately creating a world where everyone finds joy and usefulness at work. And today, you support your clients through executive and leadership coaching, and you host a private community for entrepreneurs who are ready to grow revenue and impact in the world. That's a whole lot of things that you're doing to support others, which is amazing. I think when I have a guest on that has a mission of support and service, it enhances a whole lot of things within the world and then within communities as well.
Yeah, it's definitely important to me, and it's been something that I've thought about a lot, particularly in recent years when I've been running my own business. It can be pretty easy to get in my own way and start thinking about how I'm talking about myself or what I do. And ultimately, when I stay true to the goal of supporting and serving others in particular communities that I really care about, that always brings me back to the right place to be. It seems to be the easy, then it just feels like the work is more joyful and aligned, and I'm talking to the right people, and we're having the kind of empowering and interesting conversations that I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. As I mentioned, I've only got one scripted question, and that is the very first one. And that is, where were you born and what was life like as a kid for Sarah?
Yeah. So I I was born in Baltimore, Maryland,
Okay.
and in the US. And my family lived there for 4 years. So my little brother, who's 2 years younger than I am, was born there as well. And then we moved when I was 4. And I have those early years you don't really remember a lot. So I always wonder how much my memories are real versus photographic based. That's yeah, you
Yeah,
see a
yeah,
photo and you
yeah.
can remember that. But the stories I remember my folks talking about. So we lived down the street from the old baseball stadium. It was called like Old Memorial Stadium or something in Baltimore. Now there's this fancy newer, it's not new anymore, but so
Yeah,
it was the new stadium in Baltimore. And so we lived down the street from the old stadium, so you could hear the baseball games from our house.
nice.
And I don't know if they still do this, but when I was the kid living there, you could go after the seventh inning for free.
Yeah,
And so we would walk down the street in our strollers or baby carrier, whatever they had my brother in, and go see the like last two innings of the baseball game. And I think in the late 70s, early 80s, the Orioles weren't necessarily the strongest team in the league, but it was just a fun time to see the game. And so that was the where. And I don't have a lot of memories of that, but I know from my mom that that life where we lived in a little house, but there was a street with a sidewalk that connected all the houses. So it was like semi-urban. We were
yeah,
in Baltimore city proper, but in the area that had like houses and yards.
yeah,
And she grew up, my mom grew up in Philly, and my dad grew up in New Jersey near Verona. And so they both grew up in places where you had like a house or an apartment and a sidewalk and very much that type of living. And when we moved when I was 4 to Williamsburg, Virginia, other than a brief like rental we lived in for 1 year, we lived in a much more rural type of environment, sidewalks and the houses and yards and everything, but it wasn't set up in the same way. And I remember my mom talking about that experience of how different it was from her childhood, where her childhood, everyone's out on the sidewalk and
right.
you see the neighbors. And where I grew up, we certainly saw the neighbors like walking the dog and things like that, but it was a different kind of environment. When I think about that now, living in Brooklyn and raising my kid in Brooklyn,
Yeah,
that we live in obviously a much more urban environment,
for
but we
sure.
also live in a time where there's a lot less of the like people just hanging out on the stoop and
Yep.
walking next door to play with the kids next door. It's a very different world. I know it's a bit of a meander, but that is, I lived there. We lived in Baltimore until I was 4, and then we moved to Williamsburg, Virginia. Both places we were living because of my dad's work, which was interesting because my parents met in graduate school and got their PhDs together. So they're
Okay.
both psychologists, and my mother was more like research and science based. My dad was more clinical, and she really poo-pooed him when they first met and was like, "That's not real science." But
Hilarious.
they came
Hilarious.
to see eye to eye, and then in the 70s when they made a decision about where to live once they were married and finished their postdocs, and ultimately my father, because he's a man, was offered more money, and when they had to make a decision about where to live, they picked where he had a job. And my mom used to say that she was really eager to go back to work. And then once I was born, she was like, she just didn't want to leave me because that sounds so great. But no, it was just, it was a lot harder for her to go back to work than I think she anticipated. And so she just really had a hard time being away. And so she spent much of our childhood doing a variety of different jobs related to the psychology field while our dad was working full time. So she was like editing textbooks for a while when we were little because they could send her the book and she could work in her own time. The early days of remote work.
Yeah.
And then she trained and became a professor, and she became a school psychologist. And so she could do things within the schools and work with our schedules. And in hindsight was just a very was very flexible about how she used her expertise in order to do work that was interesting to her, but wasn't necessarily a standard full-time job as a research psychologist. My
Right.
dad was the clinical, and so he eventually created his own practice when we moved to Virginia and has been doing that still to this day. He's 75, 76, and still seeing patients and all of that.
Fantastic. That's amazing. And that's interesting as well, too, that you have that background of your parents being in psychology and doing psychology work as part of their lifelong careers. And I relate to that from the perspective of being a patient and going to see psychologists and psychiatrists and different things like that. So I understand a little bit of that operation and what that entails. It definitely takes a lot of years of study, and then thereafter it's a continual process as well. But that's interesting. When you were in elementary school in Virginia, what was that like for you? Were you one of the kids who were sociable, or were you one of the kids who were just wanted to stay off into the corner and not really be seen?
I was, I definitely, in elementary school, I definitely had friends. I wasn't like social butterfly, center of attention kid,
Uh,
much more of a, I like to read books and be perceived as and responded to as the smartest kid in the class. That was definitely, I like if there was a like teacher's pet or like whatever, like that was my jam for sure.
you're an achiever.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was in first grade, I had this teacher, Mrs. Askew. She was a wonderful, really wonderful first grade teacher. I still remember her. And I don't remember the details of this, but my mom told me that the logistics of the math that we were doing in first grade was just not, it was easy for me. It was not hard. So I would finish really quickly. And she really went out of her way to find other things for me to do that were interesting. She wasn't this teacher who was like, okay, you finished the math, go read a book in the corner or something. She's, okay, here's some more interesting math. Maybe this will challenge you. And she really tried to help me keep pushing myself instead of just being like, hooray, I'm done, moving on. And in hindsight, I do feel like that laid the groundwork for me in ways that I don't know that I appreciated until I was much older, because first grade is pretty early. And so in later grades, when I was done, I wasn't like, okay, hooray, I'm done. I was like, what else? What's next? I was
Yeah,
not. And I think she really instilled that in me, that there was more that I could do. There was more that I could learn. This wasn't the end.
yeah,
On the flip side, I will say that I, as a person who was very motivated by external A's, whatever you want to call it, there were times later in school that I can see that I really didn't retain anything I learned because I was just busy trying to do what I needed to do to get the A's. And
Yeah.
that wasn't that hard for me. So I would just get the A and carry on. And then 6 months later, if you asked me what I would learned, I would be like, I don't know. I got the A. That's all that matters.
Right.
So there's a little bit of both. But yes, I would definitely liked to be, I liked the experience of being responded to as a smart kid. I definitely
Mhm.
liked that. And I really never got in trouble for anything in elementary school that I can think of. And yeah, Williamsburg was a small town, so there were only two elementary schools. There were like at the time when I was there, they were K through 3.
Yeah.
There are more now. There are more people who live there now. But when I was there, it was smaller. There was
Yeah.
one high school for the whole town and a couple elementary and then like junior highs and then the one high school. It was you kids you went to kindergarten with, you saw in high school, and there was not a huge amount of change there. Yeah.
Yeah. I have some friends that live in Suffolk, and I've been to visit them a few times. So I know the area a little bit. So it's interesting that Williamsburg is where you were raised. Also, too, what's very interesting to me is that your first grade teacher is recognizing your potential immediately. And
Mhm.
as you're finishing up your task early, she's encouraging you with some extra work to stretch you and allow you to move farther along, which ties into exactly what you're doing right now currently with your coaching executives and different things like that. So that's a nice line of connectivity within your story and seeing it that early on compared to where you're at right now. Were there any creative things that you were doing in elementary school at all? Or is it just basic general ed classes and stuff?
Yeah, I know. I'm sure we did art and like art and music and sing song circles and all those kinds of things. I have a memory of also there were concerts at the local library. My parents were
Yeah.
very, my parents, so there's a lot of music in my house. My father's a very talented musician. And
Mm.
my mother used to joke that my dad played the piano and she learned how to type on the piano. So she took piano for years, but she just never really. Whereas my father, when I was little, because I started taking piano lessons when I was, I don't know, probably 5. He was the kind of person that if he played a wrong note and he was in the other room, he would say E flat. Like he knew what the note
Yeah.
was, even in the song. Funny story about me. I was like never really in a hurry to grow up, ever.
Okay.
My mom used to joke that I was so not interested in rolling over that she took me to the doctor because she worried I might like have something wrong with me. They were like, no, she's just happy to be picked up and carried around. I was in a stroller like years, well, not years, but like a long time after other kids in the neighborhood were. And my brother was like a little kid and he could be in the stroller, but I was in the stroller, so she was carrying him. So when I took piano, when you first learn, you're just like doing the 5 notes, and at some point I progressed enough that it was time to use my whole hand, and I was insistent that I was not big enough to use my whole hand
Oh,
on the
wow.
piano. And my mom, to her credit, she listened to me and let me take a break, and I went back. So it was like when I was 5, and then I guess when I was like late 6, maybe 7, I started taking lessons again. And she was like, "All right, you're bigger now. You can play your whole hand."
Yeah.
Um, but so I was taking piano and having lessons regularly. My parents had records and I listened to classical and jazz and rock and roll. And like I have records are so special. I don't have records or record player now, but I have this visual image in my mind of the record art, the album art.
Yeah.
There was that I'm pretty sure it's Rolling Stones, hopefully, album that looked like a cake with layers of like records. And I don't even remember what album it is, but like that
Yeah.
image to me, I just thought that was so cool as a kid. I loved the picture of that
Yeah.
album, or that we had like a Sha Na Na album that I can see the pictures. The first record that I bought or that was mine was the Thriller album.
Okay.
It was a gift from my parents for Christmas or something. And then I listened to it and was promptly like horrified by like this scary like laughter and everything. Because I think
Yeah.
I don't know, I forget what year that was. I was probably like third or fourth grade. I don't know. I was like young-ish. So there was a lot of music in my life. My dad played the piano. He also had a saxophone and a clarinet. and he had an organ, like the kind that they would use in rock and roll bands in the 50s and 60s. So it was like a stand-up organ that looks like a piano.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
he had a Leslie, which is like this big wooden
yep,
speaker that has like a spinning speaker tube. So he played those just like for fun. And so that was definitely was like a decent amount of music just happening
right.
in my life. So that was probably and they would take us to local chamber music concerts and stuff, which as kids we thought was boring, but we went and obviously it had an impression on us. So
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Their work is in a structured mind framework type scenario, but they have that creative element about them that they're expressing outside of the work. So that's very interesting. Very
yeah.
interesting. And did you continue playing piano, or was it just once you learned it, it was on to the next thing?
Yeah, I took piano for until I'm trying to remember the eights. I think I was 11. I think I stopped when I was 12. So I think I was 11 when I started playing clarinet. Like it was in fifth grade, you could pick an instrument and be in the band in that elementary, late elementary, early middle school, whatever they called it at the time. And so I started playing clarinet because my dad had one, an extra one, and I liked that. And I asked to not play. I didn't really like playing piano anymore, and I liked the clarinet. And so my parents said it was fine for me to not play the piano anymore. And which is interesting because my brother continued. He started playing the saxophone and he continued playing piano and is just way more facile with it now. He could still pick things up and play things. And I can read music and work it out, but it's just a lot slower. But
Yeah,
my brother is also, I think, more like my father in that they see and experience music in some kind of structural way in their head. Like the theory is there in a way
yeah,
that it didn't just pop into my head the way that my dad was mostly self-taught. I think he had clarinet lessons as a kid, but he taught himself the piano and he taught himself the saxophone, he taught himself the organ. And he just had a real natural ability and affinity with music. And so he was my clarinet teacher.
nice.
I know I would go to band class at school, but the person who would sit with me and if you had like a weekly lesson, that was me and my dad, which was a special part.
Yeah,
And I think I like that better than going to a piano teacher's house and having lessons with her. And it was actually a pretty important piece of my life and my experience as a musician and as a clarinet player because and I think about this one of the things I think about a lot in my work now and just in general and about humans is this idea that we thrive when we can find and or create an environment where that is best suited to us and our strengths.
yeah,
And that environment can mean like legit, like I live in Brooklyn, like that environment, or it can mean the people around you and the kind of energy that people are giving you. And when I think about the experience of having piano lessons, sorry, not piano, when I think about the experience of having clarinet lessons with my father every week, where once I could play and well enough, a lot of that became we would just play duets together for a half an hour each week. And there were things that he encouraged me to learn how to play. There's this Mozart concerto that just about every clarinet player learns at some point, and
nice.
he pushed me to learn that. And but that was so very different from other people in my life and how they learned. And I do think that I was a quite talented musician. And I remember vividly that when I was a freshman in high school, you're in the band and they give you seating, like the first chair, second chair. So
Yeah,
the person who was first chair was this woman, Janelle, I forget her last name, and she was a senior. And then I was second chair as a freshman, and I was just like, oh, she was amazing. She was
right.
like tall and she had this curly hair that just seemed fabulous. And she was so good. And I was like, I can't believe I sit next to Janelle and she's a senior. And as I got to know her, she really had no joy she
Mm,
was so good. And she really did not get a lot of joy out of the music. And she told me that her parents like made her practice all the time. And she was very good. She was technically way better than I was, like in
uh,
terms of her technical ability on the clarinet. But she was the point where she told me she would practice her scales like while reading a book. Like she could put a book on her
oh
stand
wow. Yeah.
and she was just like doing it so that they could hear her practicing and was doing something else. And I just never felt that way. There were times that I was like lazy and didn't really want to practice or whatever you want to say. I don't want to say lazy, but I just didn't feel like practicing. And there were times when I would be preparing for an audition for district band or state band, and I would have a lesson with my dad, and I would do a terrible job on my scales. And it was clear that I hadn't really been practicing. But I just, I mean, A is my dad, and he's just not like a high pressure guy, but it just felt so different. It felt like it was this thing that I was encouraged and supported to do, and I wasn't
Yes.
forced to do.
Yes.
And it was also quasi therapy. Like I do remember when I was really having a hard time with something, there would be this cycle my dad and I would go through where I would be practicing. I would show him do the scales that I'd been practicing. So whatever scales I'd been working on, I would play those. And at some point I would make a mistake and I would get like frustrated. And then I would try to do it again. And it would just get worse and worse, like the scale. And then I would just say, I can't do it. I suck. And then I would start crying. And then my
Yeah.
dad would be like, all right. And then we put the clarinets down. And he'd be like, okay, what's really going on? And at some point, I would come out with whatever was bothering me. And then we would
Yeah.
work through that. And my mom, some part of this almost like script was always my mom would come in and be like, what did you do? But it was joking. And then she would leave and let us have our time. And because usually my mom was the person I would talk to. But in this setting, it was like this little I don't know, like mini therapy session with my dad where he could just tell if I was like, I suck. He's like, all right, we got to work on something new.
Right.
So yeah, I was, in case you can't tell, I was lucky to be growing up in just this incredibly kind and supportive and nurturing environment with my parents, which I recognize is definitely the exception more than the rule for many folks. So I was very
Yeah.
lucky to have that.
What's fascinating about that too is, from my perspective, is that most of the time, if you're learning an instrument or getting trained by somebody, you're going to somebody that you don't even know. You
Yeah.
have no clue about them other than the fact that they're going to teach me how to do this thing. And a lot of times they have a very stringent process that they want you to follow so that you're learning it their way, the way that they're teaching it. And the fact that you had the opportunity to have your dad be your teacher, the way I'm seeing it, it completely changed that dynamic of allowing that creativity to form and potentially flourish because of who the teacher was,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
dad, right?
Yeah.
So there was that instantaneous comfort zone that was allowed for you to step into that most people who are learning an instrument, they don't get that. So that's very interesting, as well as the fact that you would be down on yourself and then immediately he shifts into his professional mode and starts saying, all right, let's figure this out. Let's understand this a little bit better. That's amazing that you were able to experience that in learning the instruments that you did creatively. That's very cool. With being a freshman in high school and being in that position of second chair, was that kind of a scenario where it was inspiring for you to potentially try and strive further to make it to first chair? Or what was the thought process at that point in time?
Oh yeah, this is you've got the A+ girl here.
Yes.
I was like, it's
I'm
fair.
picking that up. I'm picking
Yeah,
that
I was
up.
like, it's fair. She's a senior. She should be first chair. She's definitely better than me, but I better damn well be there next year. And but it's interesting too because I think I, this is one of those areas that I do think about and I look back and I realize I definitely felt like I led a charmed life for much of my life. And I absolutely came from a lot of privilege. I was a cis white hetero woman growing up in a upper middle class family and a very stable home. Parents are in a loving and supportive marriage, et cetera. So like lots of privilege there. Both my parents went to Ivy League schools, so they educated. And at the same time, I also think that whether it was through like nudging from my parents or my own intrinsic, I don't know, gut or both, I was consistently putting myself in situations that it wasn't that hard for me to be great.
Yeah.
Like I started playing the clarinet and I liked it and I was good at it. And I was pretty quickly one of the better kids in fifth grade, which like fifth graders are not really that great musicians. So that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was clear that it was something I was good at. And so I kept doing it. And I, at the same time, there were other things that I did and I tried and I wasn't that great at. Like I played softball for a couple of years and elementary school, and I did soccer and not so great. And I was a swimmer for many years and stuck with that. And I was never an A+ swimmer. I was like definitely more of a B+. And I had a much near, but I also was really good at
Yeah.
butterfly. And so that was like, I would spend a lot of time on that. And I think that as a person, I definitely leaned into things that I was already good at,
Yeah.
that I had strengths in for whatever reason. And so that, and I know it certainly wasn't necessarily intentional at the time, but in the hindsight, it allowed me to feel like there's an extra layer of living this charmed life where I'm good at something. And so I say, okay, let's do more of that. And so it helps me to feel like I'm great because I'm leaning into something that I'm already naturally good at.
Yeah.
And so with clarinet, I practiced, but like compared to the other kids in band, I was definitely not practicing as much as they were. And I was naturally better. And that's just one of the things, like we all have things that we're good at. And there was for me, I think I understood at a relatively young age the joy in being good at something that actually isn't that hard for you and being able to actually enjoy that instead of feeling like I should work harder or I should go find something that is harder for me, that I should challenge myself more. Because it wasn't like I wasn't challenging myself. I did try to do like tricky solos that gave me really stressed out and I was going to do them wrong and things like that. But I challenged myself in ways that felt joyful. It was we had like a musical that the school did every year. And so I would do the pit orchestra for that, which was how I ended up finding my way into theater ultimately. And that was very different. And it was a much smaller ensemble. And so I was much more obvious. Like my sound is much more obvious. There are only a few of us playing clarinet. And so mistakes are more clear. If you're playing clarinet in a pit orchestra, you might be the only person playing what you're playing.
Yeah.
And so that felt like more visibility and more risk, right? And so there was an opportunity for me to do something that I was naturally good at and I felt comfortable, but in a much more uncomfortable environment. And that sort of allowed me to stretch myself in ways that worked for me instead of being like, okay, I'm pretty terrible at soccer and softball. Why don't I go play lacrosse? Like I would have been terrible at lacrosse. I would have been pushing myself, but the results would not have been terribly interesting to watch or
Right.
maybe comedic.
Yeah. Yeah. But
So
again, too, it's a scenario where you have this instinctive gift as a creative where you're leaning into that as well, rather than doing something else where you may not completely excel at. And again, the thing that I'm saying for you is the achiever component. You'd referenced earlier that a lot of times people just call you Sarah B, but I would want to flip that and call you Sarah A because you're the achiever. I'm seeing it already that you just, when you see something that you feel good at and you feel comfortable doing, you're trying to excel at that as much as possible, which is, it's fascinating for me just as an outsider to just see that within your story and be able to recognize that. It's interesting within the creative community where you hear a story and you find out if somebody's actually gifted with creativity versus somebody who has just practiced quite a bit to get to the level that they're at. And I'm hearing that had that gift within you, which again, too, your father played music as well. So it's like a trickle down scenario, one of those genetic things that is
yeah.
falling into your lap. Going into potentially sophomore year, junior year, are you still doing the band thing or are you starting to look at other types of creative outlets?
Yeah. I was just thinking about this. So throughout high school, I was still pretty much like super nerd, trying to get A's on everything. And I would say that for me, one other outlet of creativity has always been stories, fiction. I've always loved reading fiction way more than, not that I don't like reading nonfiction, but one of the ways I struggled in classes like history or science is that I would read the text and be fascinated by it, but I would read it the way I read fiction, which is like let the information wash over you and then carry on with your life, as
Yeah,
opposed to you need to learn how to absorb it and carry it keep it.
yeah,
And so definitely like reading fiction books, seeing plays, like a family would go to the theater for sure. My grandparents still lived in New Jersey, so we would go visit them for Passover or Thanksgiving, and then we would always go see a show. We'd go across the river and see a
Yeah.
show, go wait in the TKTS line and see what's cheap and see shows. So that like theater was definitely a part of my, and there was theater at William and Mary, which is the college in the town where I grew up,
Yeah.
in my high school, obviously. So I think that music was definitely a big part of my creative outlet. Reading, I would, and then, and so I actually liked, I really liked writing papers. Like I eventually became an English major in college because I liked reading fiction so much and I liked thinking about it and creating my own interpretation of what I was reading, the art of not starting from scratch. I would write journal and stuff as a kid, but I was never real big on starting from scratch and writing. I enjoyed writing as a reflection on something else.
Yeah.
And I also in I want to say my senior year of high school, I worked on the school paper, but and that was a much more, it's funny because as much as I liked reading and writing, I was more the like layout digital. I was interested in the digital tools that were,
Yeah.
and this is dating myself, but this is in the early 90s. And so we had, what was it called? Like PageMaker, I think
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
software.
PageMaker for sure. Yep. Exactly.
And it was a little ornery. Like it took
Yeah.
a little like learning to learn how to use it. And it just so happened that my sophomore year boyfriend worked on the school paper. I would hang out with him after school and
Exactly.
learned how to use the software. So when he graduated and people were like, who knows how to use this thing? And I was like, oh, I do.
Nice.
But I always had a real math brain. I had an affinity for math. And so that job of figuring out how to fit things on the page and spatial reasoning combined with the creativity of like, when should this story end and jump to a new page? Where should this picture go, et
Yeah.
cetera?
Yeah.
That was fun for me. And so I did that for 2 years and, what ended up, I think I was like one of the main editors my senior year at All Blurs Together. But so between that and swimming and band, swimming was like the least nerdy thing I did. I was
Okay.
definitely like a band nerd. And,
Right.
but yeah, and I was one of the captains of the swim team my senior year too, which was a surprise. I definitely did not think I was cool enough to be a captain, but I think people thought I was likable enough to be a captain. So
Yeah, for sure. People recognize that achiever in you. That they again, going back to first grade, that teacher giving you the extra work so that she could stretch you just a little bit more to keep you engaged.
yeah.
Somebody's giving you a position on the swim team so that you can see some of your excellence, even though you're not recognizing it yourself, somebody else is recognizing it and allowing that to move forward. Did you?
And oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
You saying that is made me think about too, that's something that I think about often now, which is the achiever often can be driven more by extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation and or at least driven, if it is intrinsic motivation, it is driven by wanting to get the A or
Yeah.
get the first, someone else telling you that you're doing a good job.
Yeah.
And it's something that comes up a lot now in my coaching work, helping adults figure out how to navigate the world as an achiever and how do you re-ground yourself in what you actually think is important versus what the world thinks is important.
Exactly.
And so working in the arts and certainly working in theater for years, and who gets to decide what is art worth looking at versus worth viewing, who gets to decide what art gets produced when it requires more than just a single person by themselves creating it, but it requires some kind of group effort to make it
Yeah.
happen, that there is the necessity of there is at least to some extent the necessity of finding approval from external sources so that it can happen or continue to happen. But finding as a creative person, how do you remain grounded in what you think is actually valuable and worth creating and good? And that came up even I think about the like my years as the school paper. Journalism is now in 2025. There's a whole bunch of other things happening in journalism that are a mess, but fundamentally, journalism is this deeply creative art where you are listening to stories, figuring out how to creatively encourage other humans to tell you their stories, and then crafting them into a narrative that is factual, but also conveys the core of whatever this topic is. And so in thinking about how do we arrange this paper? What goes on the front page? What doesn't? Which stories actually get written and which ones don't? That you're not just thinking about what do I care about as the editor, but we have an audience who reads this paper and what do they care about and how are they going to react to it? And so it just I think that the achiever thing is as always a bit of a double-edged sword, that it's something
For
that can
sure.
be motivating to do great things or even things that you might not have been able to do without that push, and can also be turn into this very limiting thing where you're doing something because you're going to get the approval or the likes or the whatever versus what it's actually meaningful to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's always the two sides to that aspect of a person. But what I'm saying in you, though, is the fact that it's spurring you along even more so to the next thing. Did you make it to the first chair?
I did. My sophomore year, I was first chair and
Okay.
I was there for the rest of school.
All right. Nice. All right. So we tie a bow on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Cool.
That happened.
All right.
I
Oh,
was in state band a couple times too. I never first chair in state band, but I got some accolades in the district and state band department as
n
well.
nice. Nice. All right. So moving into senior year, doing the paper and everything and working with layout, are you thinking that you may want to go off to college and go into a creative field, or what is the thought process at that point? And if you did, where did you go to?
I when I was I guess when I was we did the visit colleges in the spring of my junior year so that you could apply in your senior year, I think is how the
Yeah.
so yeah, my growing up it was very you go to college. My parents both went to college, so it wasn't. I'm sure if I had felt strongly about not going, they would have considered it, but it was an accepted path. I want to say it was my junior year, yes, in high school. So I liked math, and I really always enjoyed spatial. I had a strong spatial reasoning brain.
Yep.
So I had a period where I thought for sure I was going to be an architect.
Yeah.
And I really loved the idea of designing and drawing buildings. My
Yeah.
junior year in high school, so there was my school had a whole sort of technical track where you could do like auto mechanics and they had an AutoCAD class, like one of the earliest days of like the AutoCAD software where you're drawing in 3D. And so myself and another fellow nerd from my math class took this class, and it was mostly most of the kids in the class were kids who were on a very different track. And I say this with an awareness of these tracks were and have been like deeply racist and unfair and et cetera. So I'm just that is all true, and I don't mean to brush over it, but I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of that shit in public schools. But I was at a place where I was taking like algebra 2 trig or probably pre-calculus by then, and or even calculus if I was a junior. And so it all fit into my head, like how this 3D software worked. And so I was looking at it from a different way. And I remember that teacher, similar to my first grade teacher, he would say, "This is what we're learning today." And in 5 minutes, my friend Mike and I would be like, "All right, we did it." And he's okay, like, here's some other things for you to do with AutoCAD. You've got another 45 minutes of this class or whatever. And so that was another class where I really got to play in a way that was fun and exciting. And so that made me feel like I like this. I want to do more of this. I like the idea of building things. So I went through a period of thinking I was going to be an architect and go to school for architecture. And one of the schools I visited was Cornell, which has this beautiful campus, and they have an undergraduate architecture program that's just you go for 5 years instead of 4 or something like that. So you fold all this stuff in.
Yeah.
And I was learning about it and I was like, that sounds a little intense. I don't know. I don't know if I'm that hardcore. And so I ended up not picking a school that would allow me to do that, like not choosing to say, I'm going to go to the school to study this and that's it.
Got it.
And went more for the I'm going to go to college to learn how to think and figure out when I'm there like what I want to do with my life, which again is a very privileged position to be in, but it was a very special period of my life where I learned a lot. Definitely learned how to think and think critically and learn from people who are very different from me. And yeah, so that was and college was how I found my way into theater. So that was an important piece of that as well.
Okay. So at college, where did you ultimately decide to go? And at what point did you see that, okay, I'm doing the prereq stuff, getting that out of the way, but now I want to shift into something that's different?
Yeah. so I ended up going to Yale, and which is where my dad went, and it was a little bit funny. I think I mentioned before my dad was like not a very like pushy guy,
Yeah.
and when I was younger, there was something my parents was nature this like nature camp, sleepaway camp that was all about science and nature that my parents thought I would love because I like did a summer class one year that was like dissecting frogs. I thought it was so cool. And they pushed it a little too hard, and I was like adamant, I'm not going. You know, when your parents like want you to do something, you're like, I'm not doing that. And so my father sat on his hands. He would not talk about Yale at all. He was like, I'm not,
Okay.
because I think he really wanted me to go. He loved his experience there, and he was like, I cannot poison this one. So he would not talk
Right.
about it. And I remember when we visited my junior year of high school, and it was at the end of a long week of visiting a whole bunch of other schools. And it was gray, it was raining. It was like an ugly New Haven day. It was not,
Right.
it was
Yeah.
not a pretty day. And we went on this tour, and the tour guide was delightful. I remember him. He was so wonderful that people stayed like long after the tour was over because they just wanted to keep engaging with him. So that was special to be like a rainy day to have this guy. But I remember saying to my dad something about this place feels great, or I said something positive about it. And he
Yeah.
was like, yeah, it's pretty great, isn't it? Like he was very low key.
Right.
He was like, I'm not gonna push it. So yeah, so I applied to a number of places, but I got into Yale and it was my first choice. So I got to go there. And Yale's not a school that you have to like go and declare your major or anything like that. I think if you want to be pre-med, you have to start early to take all those classes. But
Okay.
and what I took, there were a few requirements like certain English literature classes, and I think there was a writing class. I forget what else, but I got to explore. And I took some psychology classes. I took some anthropology. So I went through a period of maybe I want to be a math major. That was the
Yeah.
end of my math major path. I went into my freshman year and I was taking these what it was multivariable calculus classes. This is a thing that I think about actually often about how we talk about math in general and how it's used in the world. And there's this like trajectory of you take blah 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 pre-calculus, calculus, and then you go on to like multivariable calculus. And I took this class in college thinking I'm good at math. This is what I want to do. I love my math brain. And I was teaching all of my friends the concepts. Like they were confused and I would come home and then they would all do better than I did on the test. And so when they all said, oh, we don't want to take any more math. This is awful. I thought maybe I shouldn't either because they're doing better than I am. And if someone had said to me, like, hey, there's this thing called statistics, which many people think is super boring, but is like the kind of math that's like spreadsheets and it's just
Yeah.
very literal math, I would have
Yeah.
been like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. But no, but there was no world where people said, hey, if this like multivariable calculus stuff is not your jam, it's a little too theoretical, like, how about go over here and get really concrete and make some spreadsheets? I
Right.
would have,
Right.
yes, that's awesome. So I think about that now, and whenever I'm have a chance to talk to young people about math, I always try to say, look, there's a lot of different ways you can use math and you don't have to just learn it. So the math went out the window and I started exploring more like social sciences, psychology and anthropology, and got really into that. But in the end, I think what came down to for me was that all of those fields were interesting to me because of the human stories.
Yeah.
And so that was where I ended up as an English literature major versus psychology or anthropology or something else. But yeah, all my English papers I used to write were tended to be less about. I think I look back and a lot of people I think write papers where they read a book and then they try to like pull out like historical context of the author or they fold in. And I really would write these papers where I would talk about the relationships of the people within the story and how those
Yeah.
evolved and changed and what themes they're telling us about. So it's a very psychological
Right.
approach to the story. So anyway, that so I ended up as an English major, but I meandered for a while to figure out what that would be and tried on a lot of different hats. But I think the only ones I really considered seriously were math, anthropology, and psychology before I ended up with.
Even with the thinking process of doing the English literature, you're thinking about the interactions within those storylines, which is again a trickle down effect from your parents, working with people, thinking about the mind and all of that kind of thing. So it's interesting to see these correlations throughout your story of the different aspects of who you were surrounded by are affecting ultimately what you end up shifting into. I'm also finding it very interesting that you have a diverse field of creative outlets that you've explored as well. which is another fascinating element of understanding your mind and how your mind
Mm.
is working, right, within the storyline. And the fact that that's what you ended up into was literature and stories. So it's beautiful to me to listen and hear and also share with the audience because we're literally watching a story play out and take place and see all the different elements of how things play into a story. So it's incredible. With ultimately getting into the storytelling and that stuff with the writing, when did the theater come into play at that point?
Mm. Yeah, so the entree to theater was really actually started in high school because I think I mentioned I would play in the pit orchestra for this high school musical. So once a year we would do this musical, and it was meant committing to like extra time after school for rehearsals. And my freshman year in the spring, I think I remember this right. I had a boyfriend who was a couple years older. He was a junior, and he was like a part of the theater club at school, and he did the lighting design for the school musical. And so I was playing in the pit orchestra, and then our rehearsals would end, and he was old enough to drive, so he would drive me home. And so sometimes I would stay after and watch him figuring out the lights or just like the tech kids, like the kids who are
Yeah.
doing the
Yeah.
backstage stuff, right?
Yeah.
And at the time, it didn't, I was just me hanging out with my boyfriend and my friends and like seeing what and like getting a ride home, doing high school, right?
Yeah.
And I played in the pit orchestra for all 4 years. I did audition. I did take a dance class and try to audition for the ensemble or whatever my junior year and managed to fall and dislocate my elbow in the dance class, which sort of wreaked havoc in my swimming career in my junior year. But I'm a very graceful person, like clearly
Yeah.
better
Yeah.
off in the pool than on land a little bit. But so I was thankfully a dislocated elbow. You can still play the clarinet just fine. So I did that for all 4 years, and I was in the or the concert band at school. And so when I went to college, I just planned to do all the same things. I didn't swim because swimming at Yale is actually like legit, and I probably could have been on the team, but I would have sat on the bench the whole time. And so that's a lot of time and would have been too much. But I joined the concert band, and I actually joined the klezmer band, like the Hillel Jewish student group had a small klezmer band, and
Okay.
at some point I joined a smaller chamber orchestra that had two clarinets instead of. So I was doing a number of different music things, and then there was a musical in the spring, Sweeney Todd, and I was like, I'll play in the pit orchestra. That's what I do. So it's like that's a thing, and it's just, and so I did, and our high school was pretty good. Like we had some good singers, and we put on a good show.
Yeah.
But I don't think I knew going to Yale what kind of artistic talent also was attracted
Yeah.
to the school. And so we did Sweeney Todd, which is not, it's, you don't mess around. Sweeney Todd is, and the guy who sang this part of Sweeney Todd was like a full-on opera. Like his voice was intense. And I was sitting there in this pit orchestra being like blown away by these people. And it just was like such a different echelon of work. It was just and to see the level of production value they were able to create as like undergraduate students
Yeah.
it was just a really cool thing to be a part of. And obviously the pit orchestra quality was, I don't even think I was first chair in the pit orchestra. I was just like a rank and file clarinet. That was one of the like best parts about going to Yale for me. It was very humbling. Like we're in a world where I was like the A+ first chair of all the
Yeah.
things. Like I
Yeah.
was definitely not at Yale. I was
Gotcha.
definitely not. And so I was impressed by that. And so I was like, oh, this is like the next level. I want to do more of this. And then the next year in the fall, one of my closest friends had written a play and he was going to produce it. And it's pretty easy at Yale. There's a lot of theater happening almost every weekend. It's pretty easy to produce theater. You basically can get like $500 if you sneeze and to go produce a show in one of the spaces, which is
Okay.
amazing. So he had written this play and he wanted to produce it. And I said, I want to help. Like, you're one of my best friends. Let's do this. And I auditioned as a joke and I was terrible. And he said, "You need a stage manager." And I said, "What's that?" And he explained it a little bit to me, but he didn't do a great job of explaining. And I was like, "All right, let me think about it." And I went home and this is a funny thing. I don't know if you ever watched Law and Order as a kid, but Sam Waterston, who's like the head.
Yeah.
So his daughter was one of my roommates in
Oh, wow.
college. And so I went home and I was like, "Elizabeth, what's a stage manager?" And she was like, "Oh, you'd be really good at that." I was like, "Okay, but tell me, what does this mean?" And she said, well, "You're the person who just makes sure that everything actually runs the way it's supposed to run, and you make sure people are where they're supposed to be,
Yeah.
and that everyone is talking to each other and creating the kind of show that they want to create. And I was like, okay, I think I could do that. So I did this show with my friend Barry, and I was like, this is so fun. And it was friends and making theater in a small converted. Yale had a lot of like converted squash courts, the size of a
Okay.
squash court. They
Yep.
take half of it and put some chairs, like risers and chairs in it, and then the rest you have this little stage, and you
Yeah.
have the convenient like the two doors for the entrance so that makes like a mini backstage, and that
Right.
you're done. So we did that. It was a play. It was called Misogyny that Larry wrote, and and he directed it too, if I remember correctly. And that was like way more fun than I thought. Just working with this team of people to tell a story and being the person who's helping to figure out how to make sure that everyone is working in a way that aligns for them so they can create their best work. That's really the job of a stage manager. And also
Yeah.
that the director has this vision and you're there helping them like realize that vision, helping get shit done so that they can. A lot of it is also just observation and anticipation. It can be a pretty thankless job in the sense that if you're a person who likes to be more so I feel like that was it was like it was way more fun than I anticipated. And I also like that was my first experience of theater, but I think one of the things I loved about it too was realizing, and this is in hindsight, I don't think I was as conscious of this at the time, but realizing that I could use my strengths to empower my friends to realize this dream of his to produce this show, right?
Yeah.
That like what I was doing was something that was definitely not in his wheelhouse. And he was so grateful every day for what I was doing to keep the ships running on time or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it's what keep the trains running on time, keep the ship afloat, all that. And so I did that and I said maybe I could be like an assistant stage manager on a bigger show. And so like the spring version of the musical that year was going to be Into the Woods, another Sondheim. And it's run by like the Yale Dramat, which is like this more official theater association versus the little
Okay.
shows we all throw together in this. So I went to the Dramat and I was like, hey, I'm interested in learning more about stage management. Could I be like an assistant on the musical? And the person I talked to was like, oh, it's cool, good to know. And a week later, he's come to this meeting and he's so Sarah wants to stage manage this show. I was like, that's not what I said. I didn't say I wanted to stage manage. I don't know anything about a like big musical on a stage like this. Like I want to learn. So yeah, long story short, I got roped into it. And it was a pretty wild decision because I was still in a chamber orchestra at the time. And I was like, I can only do this if you're cool with me not being available on the days of our final performances for the chamber orchestra, which I think conflicted with tech rehearsal. So I have no idea how they did it. I can't remember, but it was the kind of thing where like clearly in hindsight they were desperate for stage managers, and
Right.
I didn't know. I
Yeah.
didn't know that this is the thing. So my second show I ever stage managed was like a large theater production of Into the Woods with a full musical cast and moving scenery and like
Yeah.
all that. So I definitely was thrown off the deep end a little bit, but yeah, that so my I can thank Sondheim and my dear friend Barry, who was a big lover of Sondheim, for my introduction to the theater in a big way.
Yeah, I relate to that a bit in terms of putting on some fashion shows that I've done, having to coordinate all of that type of stuff, making sure models are getting where they need to be, getting the outfits that they need to have, all that kind of stuff. And then even producing some musical events, bringing in bands, making sure you've got the stage hands that are wheeling in the equipment and all that kind of stuff. So I can relate to that aspect. I've done a bit of that myself, and that's what kind of drew me to having you on is being able to tell part of that story as well from your perspective. Did you see that as once you got into it, got thrown into the deep end of being in that position, did you see that as something where it was like, oh wow, this is really something that I think I can excel in and I can achieve at and really want to get into doing this and doing it more?
Yeah, I would say yes. And in some ways, like, yes, that I thought I was good at it in certain ways. yes, I wanted to do it more, but also I think what the bigger thing I realized with doing Into the Woods and that bigger show was that this was something that I enjoyed and I thought I was pretty good at it, but I also, there weren't a lot of people who wanted the job.
Right.
And so if I wanted to do it,
Exactly.
then I could,
Yeah.
which was interesting because that was a new thing, like to do something that wasn't like people weren't super into it. And people were like, do you want to be on stage? And I'm like, no, thank you. I'm perfectly happy to be like behind the curtain with the
Yep.
headset on, whatever, in the dark.
Yep.
That's great. With the little, I did love the God mic like that. I don't know if you've heard of this, but in when you, my first introduction to that was this show. And when you're in tech rehearsals and the stage manager will often sit in the audience and all the lights are out. And so you have this microphone that it's for safety reasons, but also just to work things when you're practicing in tech rehearsals with all the lights and sound and everything, to be able to get on this microphone so everyone can hear you say stop, essentially.
Yeah.
And you say, so hold please. But to have this microphone where like you're basically telling everyone, including the director, just stop now
Yeah,
and do what I
exactly.
say. That was pretty great. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
That was definitely a fan of that. And I would say that that experience was also the stage, the setting of my first experience with a very public and like abject failure on my part, which was an like useful and intense experience, because an experience of not having asked enough questions, so not realizing what I was getting myself into, right? And also other people's expectations of me not aligning with what I thought that things were. So those I think have really informed me in a lot of ways throughout my life, because the when you do a show, if people, when you're working on a show that there's any desire to take photos, then typically what you do is a photo call. So that the only time people wear their costumes and everything looks like it's supposed to look in the press is the final dress rehearsal. And the next day you have previews or opening or whatever you're doing. And so you have this one day where everyone has just gone through the whole show in costume. Maybe you even stopped a few times because you had a train wreck, but hopefully through it as quickly as possible. It's late at night, you're all exhausted, and now you need to take pictures in these costumes.
Right.
And you want to get the key pictures, whatever pictures the director thinks is most important, or if it's a big theater, then you have like PR people who decide also which pictures are important. And so you actually have to go backwards through the show because you have the last scene, everybody's in costume. So you might as well take pictures of that and then start working your way backwards. But there are also ways that you could, depending on what pictures you need, you can squeeze in someone who's, this is a picture from the first scene, but we don't need them for anything else, so that they can show up and get their picture taken while other people are doing other things. That's ideally how it works. Someone said to me in passing at some point, oh, and after the dress, we're going to do photo call. And I said, okay. But no one said, and you're going to run it. I didn't ask any questions like, what's photo call? What does that look like? So when it was time for photo call, someone turned to me and was like, okay, what do we do? And I was like, what do you mean? It's photo call. Who's in charge? And they were like, you are. I was like, oh, shit. And I did legit, I cried. Like, I legit just cried. I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't. And thankfully, God bless this woman, Tiffany, who was a year or two ahead of me in school, and had stage managed a show before and had showed up a few times and was like a mentor to me and was help because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Who, you guys can be anyone who can help me here. And so for this photo call, she happened to be there already just because she was being supportive. And she just like, took the reins and was like, I got this. We'll
Nice.
figure it out. And so she ran with it. And thank goodness for her. Like, I just felt so supported. She didn't judge me. She wasn't like, who the fuck are you? This is like, you're sitting here crying and we're supposed to be doing a photo call and everyone's exhausted and wants to go home and you're just crying, whatever that. There's no
Right.
crying in baseball, right?
Yeah.
So she took over. And I'm going to tell you, from that day on, I, every, I have a reputation for running the best photo calls. All of
Nice.
my friends who got married asked me to run the wedding photo calls for them. Like I was like, learned my lesson. I was like, I'm going to run a tight photo call. My
Yeah.
directors were always impressed. They're like, you got that many pictures in an hour? And I was like, yeah, I don't fuck around, man. This is how we do it. Like we get it done. But it was very public. Like everyone's in the theater and everyone clearly was assuming I was going to be in charge and then I was not. And I was
Right.
crying. And so, yeah, I learned an important lesson about asking more questions and assuming that people think I'm going to be in charge until proven otherwise, because nobody else really wants to be in charge.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a big learning for me. And so to go back to your question about was this something I want to do more of, I think at the same time, because I walked into this show feeling, I don't know what I'm doing. How could you possibly want me to be the head stage manager on this show? And then doing it and getting to the end and being, that was pretty awesome. And I did a great job. And I did a lot of things completely wrong.
Yeah.
So let's do more. And I didn't ever, in college, I didn't ever do another show on that big stage. I did smaller shows, but I ended up continuing to do theater throughout. And I really, a lot of the theater I did was built on relationships that I formed in that production of Into the Woods. There was a director that I worked with a couple times who was the assistant director on that show. And that I think also taught me early on just the value of in any environment finding your people and then making the effort to carry them with you.
Yeah.
And there were some incredibly talented people on that show. I don't know if you listen to NPR,
Yeah. A
like
little bit.
so morning the what is it called, morning edition, so Ari Shapiro on NPR. So he was the wolf prince in that production of Into the Woods,
Okay.
and his husband, who's a very talented lawyer in the DC area, was the narrator.
Nice.
These are people who were extraordinary voices and performers, and Ari still performs with Pink Martini and sings. Like the people I was in the room with were like really impressive talents who then also went on to not necessarily do this for a living, but clearly are, when you have someone who, like Michael, who was the narrator, who can stand on stage, and as an actor, he was in other shows that I did at school too, that as a lawyer in the courtroom is an extraordinarily helpful skill, right? To be in the midst of a situation where you have a script you're planning to follow and then shit goes awry and you have to know how to navigate that. And there's a whole bunch of people who are in that show. Maria Cristina Oliveras is still performing and singing in New York to this day. I think she's in the show right now.
Nice.
It was a very talented crew and people on that I worked on shows throughout. And it was I definitely my first taste of a big show where it's a musical and it's fun to call all the cues and work in a room full of a lot of people, and not just this little intimate theater, which is a whole different kind of show and also really special. Yeah, that is a very long answer to did I
No,
want to do
that's all
more of
right.
it?
That's
But
all
I
right.
did not think of it as a career at all. I'll be totally honest with you. It was something I was doing for fun.
Okay.
It did not register as a career at all until after I was out of college, which sounds wild because I grew up going to see Broadway shows. Like I knew that this is what people did for
Did.
work. Like that,
Yeah.
if I thought about it, like of course, the people on the Broadway stage, that's their job. But I
Yeah.
just didn't somehow put the pieces together. And I was looking for my when I graduated from college and I went to the kind of school where plenty of people are like going on a trip to Europe for a couple of months, or there was plenty of money around and
Sure.
people that was not something that I had an option to do. And I thought I'm gonna spend my summer after college doing something fun, but that pays me. So I decided to look into this whole summer theater thing. But I was nervous about choosing to go live somewhere for 3 months with people that I might not like. So I applied to and got a job at the Virginia Shakespeare Festival, which is at William and Mary in my
Yeah. Yeah.
hometown. So I thought if I hate everybody, I'll just go home every night and I'll just do the job and I won't sleep in the dorms and I won't
Yeah.
do the whole thing. And I was planning to move to Boston after that because my boyfriend at the time, it's a recurring theme in my story, different one from high school, but boyfriend at the time was in Boston at Harvard Business School, law school, sorry, Harvard Law School. And so I was planning to go move to Boston to be near him. And so while I'm doing this summer job, I'm interviewing for, I don't know, I'm this is the day of sending resumes by mail, occasionally emailing people. I was applying for jobs like administrative jobs in all the colleges in Boston. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was like, somebody will pay me to do something. I'm a smart person. And I remember some of the actors that I was working with at VSF, and they said, "Oh, you're moving to Boston. What theaters are you looking at?" I legit went, "What?" And then it dawned on me that all of these people around me, like this is what they do for their life's work.
Yeah.
Again, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it genuinely was. I think because I grew up in a home where, all of the professions available to me were not artistic. My
Yeah.
dad was a psychologist and he played music for fun. He was in a rock and roll band. He was in a klezmer band that he's still in to this day. But it
Yeah.
was something, and they got paid for gigs, but it was like they got paid a couple $100 and it was like fun for them.
Yeah.
And we went to theater as entertainment, but it wasn't like, oh, and these people do this for a living. And so it just didn't somehow click in my brain
Yeah.
until these actors asked me. And I was like, oh. And so that was when I shifted and started actually looking for theater work in Boston and decided to try to get paid to do
Okay.
the work.
Okay. One of the interesting things that I saw in that story was the fact that you're put into a position and you're like, oh crap, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. I suck. And then this lady comes in and says, I got you. Everything's cool. We'll take care of it. Which took me back to when you were doing your piano or your clarinet lessons and your father was working with you and you get frustrated and you'd be like, I suck. I can't do this. And then he's like, all right, so let's address this. Let's take care of it. So those two adult figures coming in to the rescue when you're feeling down and like you can't do the thing that you need to be doing in that moment. And I don't know if those things stick out to you or not, but I'm seeing those as elements of where people are there to support you when you're feeling not as much like yourself that you want to be. And still holding you and supporting you and encouraging you along. And I saw that as just a beautiful example of a community type scenario where somebody can come in and they support you when you're feeling like you can't do it anymore, but they just guide you a little bit and encourage you, and then it allows you to move on further along and progress you into realizing, hey, at some point, now I see this as something I can actually do. I
Yeah.
can do this and I can get paid for it, and this can be potentially my career. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's interesting too, now that you mention it, that like the example I would layer on top of that too, that in both cases, the person noticed I was struggling, like my dad, and then this woman, Tiffany, who was probably like a year ahead of me in school, maybe. And but that neither of them did it for me. I feel like when I told the story before, I might have said Tiffany stepped in and she did. But now that I remember, like she did long enough that I could pull myself together.
Yeah,
And then I went back to the table and I put my headset on and she guided me. She said, okay, what if we do this next? And then I would tell everyone what to do because I was doing just fine with that, but I just didn't understand what the photo call was supposed to be.
yeah,
And so she was guiding me, but I was doing the work. She wasn't doing it for me. She wasn't taking it away from me. Same with my dad. He never was like, I'll play these scales for you. That wouldn't help me at all. And so I think that also has informed me in the way that I see both just as a coach, like that I was a consultant for a few years and shifted to when I was running my own business and shifted to coaching. And that it feels way more aligned for me that rather than doing something for you as a consultant where I'm going to say, here's a thing and now go take it and do what you want. As a coach, my job is to empower someone to grow
yeah,
themselves, right? And I'm not even giving advice. I'm asking questions and helping them navigate their own path to success. And that just having experienced myself both how empowering that can be. And then, of course, later in life, when I've worked in jobs, primarily in like corporate settings, where if something I did wasn't quite what someone wanted and they just took it away and did it themselves, like how disempowering that can be.
for sure.
And so, yeah, that those both of those they do parallel for me in me experiencing that power of being able to figure it out yourself, but with help
Yeah,
instead of just instead of someone saying, I'll do it for you, or instead of someone saying, here's what you should do, good luck. It's no, I'm actually here and
yep,
I'm here to support you along the way, and you can do this. Like
yes,
it's like yeah. So
very much, very much. All right, so you spent roughly 10 years in that industry doing that. How in the world did you shift from that to going into tech startups?
it's you're probably not surprised that people ask me that question a lot. And I also, because I have the gift of hindsight, can see this particularly clearly now. The world of theater and tech startups is actually really not that different.
Okay,
In both cases, you have a group of people who are trying to do something incredibly creative and different that's never been done before with as quickly as possible with as and like as efficiently as possible, trying to spend as little money as possible to do the thing, right?
yeah,
Now
yeah,
granted, the bucket of money that your average startup has versus the bucket of money that your average theater production has tend to be different.
yeah,
Not a lot of money in theater, but there are plenty of scrappy, bootstrapped startups that don't have a lot of money either, right? In the end, you have people who are trying to do something that's never been done before in a room together, trying to get creative. And even if you are doing a production of Hamlet, which has been done however many times, it's not like you want your Hamlet to be the same as anybody else's. You want it to be, your goal is that it is different, right? You have this visionary director who's going to see the play and read the play on the page and see what it's going to look like on stage and gather people around them to make it happen. And you have a visionary CEO for a startup who says, I see this problem. Here's how I think we should solve it. I'm going to gather the people around me to make this happen. And they're both quick moving, like people work long hours, all that stuff. So there's just a lot of similarities that I see. And I tell my theater friends that I was like, when I was working in stars, like, I'm still herding cats. It's just a different industry. It's not that different. Particularly
Right.
working in customer success in the tech world, the job, because the mission of the customer success role is typically pretty closely aligned to helping existing customers be successful so that they stick around and keep giving you money and maybe give you more money. And so you are really sitting in the same way that the stage manager is at the hub, the center, making sure that everyone is talking to each other that needs to, and you're facilitating conversations with people who have trouble talking to each other, and you're
Yeah.
making sure everyone in the room, in the theater or in the company, in the startup, understands what's happening outside the room, outside the company, and vice versa. That's a real similarity between a customer success and a stage manager. So hindsight 2020 a bit, but I think that was a part of what allowed the startup founder who ended up hiring me. He had the vision to hear me talk about myself and say, I see how you could be helpful here.
Yeah.
As for my own internal journey of I left because I did love theater and I found the work incredibly fulfilling. I lived in New York and I went to grad school. I went back to Yale for 3 years and got an MFA in stage management. So like I put a lot of time and effort and energy into being the best stage manager I could be, A+. Aren't really the same kind of A+ in the world of theater or stage management as there is in school. And I've been working in the industry for a while. I've been living in New York. And the two big things that really made me feel like it was time to leave was that I had met my now husband, who's an actor. So we were living together and probably going to get married soon. I don't think we were engaged yet when I started thinking about this. And I'd also worked on two shows in succession at relatively small theater in Manhattan, but they were two shows with the same theater company, very different shows, both incredibly artistically fulfilling. Relatively small show, like theater, a relatively small paycheck, but artistically fulfilling, amazing humans that I worked with. The playwright of one of them is someone who I like to admire to this day. He's won MacArthur Genius Grant, so he went to grad school together. Like he's just one of those people that if I could have spent my whole life just stage managing his shows, I would have said, all right, that's worth it.
Yeah.
So I'd had these two shows and I looked at them and I said, this is amazing. And it's not, when I look at all the other things I have to go through to do shows like this, it's not enough. This is not enough. This is not, the good is not high enough to balance out the shit I have to go through to do shows like this and the poor pay and the like
Right.
stress of, because I was making a living as a stage manager. My primary funds were coming from stage management. I was working enough, but I was also, this was the early, like late 2000s, like 2009, I was making 35, maybe 40K a year and living in New York City, right?
Yeah.
So I'm eating like pasta and mac and cheese and peanut butter and jelly and apples and I was making it work, but it's tough. And so that piece, the artistic fulfilling, and I felt like there were parts of my brain that really weren't being stretched.
Yeah.
That I had worked on Mary Poppins on Broadway, and so I had seen what it was like to work on a longer running Broadway show. And there's some creativity to that, but there's some like monotony to it. You're doing the same
Yes.
show, 8 shows a week. And
Yes.
the creativity is about how can you fuck with each other backstage to keep it interesting and not mess up the show. So there's that like artistic, like intrinsic motivation of I want to do something more interesting with my brain and my work. And then I'm also I like to be in control of things, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And so having a relatively unstable career, freelance theater, you're getting a new job every 3-4 months, and it's always a different employer, you're always looking for work. When I was single, felt manageable because I could control everything else in my life. But once I introduced another person, I was like, oh wait, I can't control this other human, much as I might want to.
Yes,
You always got
exactly.
a partner. There's like a moment where you're like, but can I just make you be the way I want you to be? But anyway, I can't control that they're human. And so now I've got my unstable career and like the instability of another human. It just felt like a little too, and then I thought I want to have kids someday. And that felt okay, that's a lot of instability. And I was lucky enough that there are women in my life who were quite successful stage managers who were a little further along in years than I was. And I could look at their lives. They had kids and they were very happy with their lives. And because I think it's particularly as a woman, it can be easy to not have a role model. And so you can go, okay, no one's done it before, but maybe I'll be the one to make it work.
Yeah.
And or it's impossible, no one's done it, so I can't. But for me, I had people I could look at and say, these are women who are building successful careers as stage managers in New York City. They love their lives, and I don't want that. Like I can see that, and I don't want what they have.
Yeah.
And there are other options. I could have gotten an academic job because I had an MFA. I could have tried to go work at a resident regional theater, be resident stage manager regional theater, but for various reasons, they were not aligned with the life I wanted to have with my future husband in New York. And so I thought, I'm a pretty smart person.
Right.
I could probably do a lot of things. They might even pay more. That could be
Yeah,
great.
for sure.
And so I just started having coffee, like virtual or real, with people or phone calls where I would say some version of this is what I'm good at. If I worked at your company, what would I do? And the first couple of phone calls, I learned pretty quickly that I couldn't talk about all of the things that a stage manager does because I remember my brother-in-law had just finished, my now brother-in-law had just finished Harvard Business School. And so he introduced me to a few people in the corporate world.
Yeah.
And I was on the phone with one of them describing what I do. And she was like, that's all one job. She was like
Exactly.
distraught. She couldn't like
Exactly.
she was I don't understand. It
Right.
was very like I could feel her getting stressed and she was like, I don't know what you would do. Like you could be HR, you could be like operations, and maybe you'd be like customer face. Like she just was like spinning and I was like, okay. I need to find a new. So that was interesting. So I learned that I had to really hone in on not just what am I good at, but what do I actually want to do with my time and
Yeah.
get much more specific. And so over the course of the summer, by the time I met with the CEO of Olo, Noah Glass, I had gotten pretty good at talking about myself in a way that people could understand that weren't theater people
Right.
and talking about it in a concise way. But the other piece that really made the transition for me going back to relationships, I was and community and like finding your community or your people, whether they stick around for a minute or years. In order to pay the bills, I chose to stop saying yes to theater jobs just so I would not keep taking them. So I got a job through a temp agency. And so I was like acting as the executive assistant at a venture capital firm just through the job that this temp agency put me in.
Yeah.
And there was this woman there who I think her name was Michelle. And she just was like, she was probably maybe 20 years older than me, maybe even more, but she just was so put together and not in an ostentatious way. She just was like, I was like, that lady is a badass. I don't know. She just,
Yeah.
she's got her shit. And it was clear that this firm was like mostly older white men. And she was a white woman, but she was like she's classy, knew what she was doing. And she was in the office next to the one that I was sitting in as this executive assistant. And she was really interested in me because the temp agency that they worked with tended to hire artists. And so she was like, oh, what's your story? Are you an artist? So I explained and I said, but I'm actually trying to leave. So she was like, look, I told her what I was trying to do and get something in business, but I wasn't sure. And she said, let's have breakfast. And she had breakfast with me and she brought the names of five, I think, different founders whose companies they had invested in.
Yeah.
And she said, go Google these people, tell me who you want to meet, and I'll introduce you.
Okay.
And like, I was just incredible. She didn't know me from Adam. I think she had heard that I was like doing a good job. But executive assistant doesn't necessarily mean that I can do other stuff. But I think she thought I
Right.
was interesting.
Yeah.
And so one of those people ended up being Noah, who by the time I talked to him, our breakfast was like in April. And I don't think I finally talked to him until August. And so by then I had meandered my way through talking to a variety of other people and so I'm having, and all of my coffees were, this is what I'm good at. If I worked at your company, what would I do? And who else do you think I should talk to? That was the whole agenda, 30 minutes or less, sometimes 20. And so I went into this conversation with Noah with the same plan. And 20 minutes in, he says, okay, the head of operations is about to go on sabbatical for 6 months. Do you want to come work for us for 2 weeks and see if you like it and see if we like you? And I was like, you want me a job? What's happening? I'm very confused. I thought we were just having coffee.
Yeah.
And the company was like 9 people at the time. It was very early stage. And so that was my entree, and that was how I moved from theater to tech startup. And it really, a part of it was that Noah had the vision to meet me and see the hole that he was going to have at his company and see that I had the skills to fill that hole.
Yeah.
And because the company was so early stage, the 9-person startup, everyone's making it up as they go along anyway. And so the fact that I didn't know, I hadn't worked in business before, he's like, clearly you're a smart person. You can run things and order a whole bunch of people around. So you know what you're doing, and we just need to point you in the right direction, and that'll be valuable. So I definitely appreciate his vision to be able to see past the job title to what I could actually bring to the table.
Cool. Very cool. All right. So Noah sees past the job title, and based on what your experience is, he's realizing instinctively, from my perspective, is that you can do this and you've got the capabilities to do. So he offers you this test run. And where does that lead in terms of you coming into the tech industry and then bringing those skill sets from the creative community in the theater world? How does that develop out from there?
Yeah, it was, you've got it right, that really he saw past job titles, or don't even know that he had a job title in mind. He just saw a gap and saw I had some skills and was like, I think
Right.
these fit together nicely. And so the company, the startup, was 9 people at the time, and including me. So it was quite a small early stage team in that world where every person pretty much did a job that nobody else did when your team
Yeah.
is that small.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways, while there were things about working in the tech world that were new or unfamiliar, I had spent enough time on computers and email and things like that that I knew how to I knew how to write an email. A lot of my job as a stage manager was communication, that I don't know that I fully appreciated that until I was sitting at this desk writing, communicating with people over email and coordinating with external customers and internal folks. But I do remember early on at one point, Noah said something to me. I can't remember his exact words, but it was this funny moment where he said, I had sent him some email and he said something like, how do we get everybody else in the company to write emails more like you do?
Nice.
It was like, clearly the English major in me is coming out in the way that but I was just a little, because as a stage manager, part of my job was to be the sort of written representation of the show, right? You have all these people like designers and tech people who are not in the room, that just basic things, like I would always start an email with a hello, whoever, specifically addressing the person on the email who needed to do something. And so if it was 3 people, I would say Jenny, Joe, and Julie, like,
Right.
these questions are for you, because often there's 75 people on the email and who they need to know who's doing what. So there were just things that I learned from managing productions of 10 people or 100 people that were relevant to everything that I was doing,
Yeah.
and things that I learned from juggling the balls of people who are in the room and not in the room, which is essentially the same thing as customers who are not in the room with you, and whoever works at the company who is in the room with you. And if you are running a remote company, then people who are not in the room with you but work with you. At the time, all 9 of us were in New York in this little office in Soho, in the middle of all the fashion people. It was like us and our little startup. But there were a couple of things that are funny to me, but I always remember about this time. For example, in theater, you basically work 7 days a week, six days a week, and then you have one day off, right? Especially if you're running a show, then you have your first performances are maybe around 7 on a Tuesday, and your last show ends around 5 or 6 on a Sunday. And so you have quasi dinner time Sunday through breakfast, lunch on Tuesday, but really, particularly if you have to do an understudy rehearsal or something on Tuesday, the weekend is not, there's no weekend. You work on the weekend, and then you have
Yeah.
this day,
Yeah.
Monday, to do your groceries and your everything. You do your everything. And so I was doing, I remember the first week, months, I was doing this office job, and we would leave the office at, 5 or 6 on a Friday. And it was in the early stages of this company. So we were not like crazy, insane schedule. We were working hard, but not 70 bajillion hours a week. So we would leave at 5 or 6 on a Friday, and then we would come back. I think most folks came in around 10 because it was a more engineering heavy team. And so on Monday, so I would see people on Monday and I'd be like, I haven't seen you guys in forever. It's been so long since I've seen you. It just felt like eons, like to have this whole go to bed, walk home on Friday and have 3 sleeps
Right.
that I saw no one I worked with and 2 whole days and they were weekend. It just was a wild. And to know, I remember also knowing, being able to say to my husband, oh, like we can plan to go somewhere. I think I started working in there in August and I said, oh, we can plan to go somewhere on Thanksgiving and I can just ask for those days off right now at the end. And I don't have to, just keep it in limbo because I don't know what show I'm going to be working on or whatever. And while I was working there, we got engaged and then got married. And so we were able to actually like plan the wedding and say, I'll be away for these 2 weeks for my honeymoon, which was just wild. Like that just, which seems everyday things to most people who work in an office job. But to me, it was this sort of magical time. And so the little life things were really neat, knowing that I was going to get a paycheck every month and it was going to be the same amount and I was going to have health insurance. And it seems like small things, but that was pretty joyful. And it makes me sad that in this country, artists don't get that.
Yeah.
Or at least it's not, unless you are using your artistic skills to work for an institution that has given you a full-time job of some kind, then it's hard to find that as an artist or creative of any kind. And so those like life things were fun discoveries and just learning how to, it reminded me a bit of what it's like to go from being in college to going into the real world where you don't have to write papers and study anymore and you suddenly go, oh my God, I have so much free time. And
Yeah.
so similarly going from working in theater to working in this tech startup, which a lot of people think of tech startups as crazy long hours, but to me, I was like, oh my God, I have so much free time
Right.
because in theater, whenever I was not in tech rehearsals and working crazy long hours, and I was often like looking for the next job or whatever it might be, or it was just the simple act of working 6 days a week is intense. So those were interesting. But then in terms of translating the work that I had been doing as a creative and the theater and all that, it particularly now, I mean, it's much more clear in hindsight, but the world of, I have come to realize that the world of startups, tech startups, and the world of theater are really not that different, at least when I think about the role that I played in each of those spaces, because in theater, you have a group of people who come from all different perspectives and backgrounds and have different disciplines coming in a room together to create something that's never been done before and do it as quickly as possible with as little money as possible.
Right.
And tech startups are the same thing. Granted, the bucket of money is bigger, but the motivation is still similar to say, like, how can we do this with as little money as possible, as few people as possible now, and then scale that in some way. And being in a room with people who are trying to do something that never been done before was, I did this every day. This is not weird for me, which is funny to think about taking someone from theater and throwing them into a startup is actually maybe an easier fit than taking someone, say, from a long corporate career in larger, more established companies and throwing them into a startup because they just haven't had that experience of let's make it up as we go along, build the plane as we fly it, whatever metaphor you want to use.
Yeah.
So that it just felt very quite comfortable to me. And then I also felt like being in a room, the people, that early group of 9 people were just so freaking smart. Like I was in this room with incredibly smart people and we would just have lunch and eat regular sandwiches, but sit around the table and talk about everything from maybe we talk about work stuff, but we talk about things like is cell phone service the way that it is and like why can't it be better or just like random stuff. Why does chicken in America taste like nothing? Because we had a couple of folks on our team who were not born in the US and they were like, why does your chicken have no flavor?
Right.
I just remember having this intellectual stimulation that was really special. And one of the things that I was looking for when leaving the theater, not to say that there weren't plenty of intellectually stimulating people in the theater, more that my job itself was not as intellectually stimulating as I thought my brain would like, and being able to be in a room with these folks and have those kind of conversations on a daily basis was really a fun shift for me to have.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is if the environment coming from a theater community that's highly creative, highly adaptable in coming up with the character and different things like that. And a lot of times those actors are also have other creative abilities that they're doing as well. Being in that environment for so long and then shifting into this new environment of tech, were you able to see that a lot of what their creativity might have been was still fundamentally stimulating compared
Mm.
to the theater?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you're asking about the like different creative types of creativity that I was seeing
Yes.
in the tech startup world
Yeah.
versus and the and 1,000% yes, actually fundamentally believe that every human is creative and has that's sort of part of what makes us human.
Yeah, same here.
And whenever I talk to someone who says, "Oh, I'm not creative," I'm like, "What is your definition of that word? What does that word mean to you?"
Exactly.
Because when I think about the what it's like to be in a room of a early stage startup with 9 people, and what it's like to sit in a room in a rehearsal room with 9 people or 20 people who are rehearsing a play that's never been produced before, or the 70 billionth production of Hamlet, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
These are everyone is trying to do something that's never been done before, and that just fundamentally requires a level of creativity and ability to think differently. And when I think about just the early engineers, the person who eventually became the CTO, the chief technical officer of the company, and some of the earliest engineers who stuck around for a long time, many years with the company, though their ability to problem solve in creative ways was just incredible. And also the sort of rigor with which they would push back, because I was the primary and there was one other person who were like the primary customer facing people in the company, and so I would be interacting with the product and the customer and then come back to the team and say, hey, this is funky, or this is weird, or people are confused about this, or how can we do this differently. And just the sort of willingness to spitball and try things and talk about it and say, and ask questions. Is the problem this, or is the problem this? Or, and really have those conversations where my favorite is when the customer says something like, the analogy I always give to customers is, I want a purple fuzzy unicorn. And it's okay, we don't sell purple fuzzy unicorns. And we could just say that. Or we could say, what's the problem you're trying to solve with this purple fuzzy unicorn? And as you dig into that a bit, when the customer ultimately says, oh, I want something like soft and cuddly to sleep with at night, then you can go, okay, look, we have this orange fuzzy bear.
Yeah.
It's we think you could try sleeping with it at night. Like, why don't you take this home, give it a shot, see how it is? And they come back and they're like, wow, this is great. This was actually really loved, this warm fuzzy bear. It worked great, except that the nose on the bear is hard and it kept poking me in the eye when I was sleeping, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it's okay, probably a unicorn wouldn't have been a great idea either, because the unicorn would
Exactly.
have stabbed you in the eye. And so it's a silly analogy, but that comes up. It came up all the time in theater. The theater piece of it is, as a stage manager, you're in the rehearsal room and the director says, next time we do this scene, this is like an argument with Mary and Joe, and you say, next time we do this scene after we come back from break, I want Mary to have a sandwich. And
Yeah.
I could just say, okay, and I could go to the deli and buy a sandwich for $2 or whatever. Not $2 anymore, but buy a sandwich, spend the like little bits of money we have for rehearsal props on that. Or I could pause and ask the question and say, okay, you want her to have a sandwich. What are you trying to play with here with this sandwich? Is it that you want Mary to have food in her mouth? Is it that you want Mary to gesticulate with the sandwich? And that's funny. Is it that you want Mary to throw the sandwich at Joseph? And we figure that out. I don't know why I went with Mary and Joseph, which is very like
It's
Christmassy
all right. We'll just
something.
roll
I
with
don't
it.
know. But anyway, it was hilarious. But and then the end they say, okay, I want that to be something that she can gesticulate with and throw. That I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to go in the kitchen. I'm going to get 2 sponges and a rubber band, and here's your sandwich, because now she can throw it and it's safe and it's free because I have that. And so that was a huge part of the job as a stage manager, was like, how can I get 2 sponges and a rubber band and solve the problem in the moment? And I saw that all the time in the work that I was doing with this tech startup, being able to sit in a conversation with an engineer and a product person and say, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And let's make sure we actually understand the problem before we start building the purple unicorn that nobody actually wants.
Yeah, exactly. I relate to this a lot because of the fact that when I started out my working career, I started out working at a sub shop. like a Jimmy John's or a Jersey Mike's,
Mm.
and worked there for 2 years and then got moved up into a shift leader position and then eventually into management and then running multiple stores and doing franchise training. And that knowledge that I had of working in those positions and managing the team that was on the crew at that scheduled time of the day, I've always been able to transfer that over into every industry that I've ended up working in, whether it was fashion or jewelry or entertainment, all of that type of stuff, because you start to get a perception of being able to recognize individuals' strengths and weaknesses pretty quickly and
Mm.
understand too that every time you hire somebody in new, they're always going to be extremely nervous and uncomfortable until they get used to it. So being able to pick that out, working with people, looking at their strengths and weaknesses, understanding, okay, if they're weak over here running a cash register, then I don't want to put them in that position because it's going to make them even more uncomfortable and enhance that weakness. I want to put them over in this other position where they're stronger, they're not going to be uncomfortable, and they're going to excel. So I see that as a fascinating element that you have within you, characteristic that you're taking that from the creative industry, moving into another industry, which is not really always considered creative, but the people that are in that, they have to think creatively in order to make it work. And so I see that you're coming in, you're being able to pivot from one creative industry into another, but still implement some creativity in the way that you're thinking and managing and operating. I find that very fascinating. And hopefully the audience can see that as maybe a blind spot that they could have potentially of where they think, oh, I can't go and do this job because I'm only good at this or that. But if you have some critical thinking ability and analytical thinking ability, be able to recognize opportunity where it may be, then a pivot into another industry with your skill set is not impossible whatsoever. And I just wanted to point that out. With working in this position, how long did you work in that position before shifting into something else? And how fulfilling was it for you once you got into the weeds with it?
Yeah, so it's funny that my trajectory with that company was I worked there for a year and change, year and a half, I think. And then I left for 4 years and then I came back and worked there for 4 years.
Okay.
And part of what happened in that first year, it was the year that I got married. A lot of big changes in my life. I left theater, I got married, working in this tech startup. And I loved the work. I loved the people I was working with. I loved the intellectual stimulation, as I said. And the only thing that I was trying to juggle a little bit was it was the first because that my all my previous jobs had been theater jobs, or it was like a temp job that I was just taking to pay the bills for a brief period. This is my first experience having a long-term job that wasn't like artistically fulfilling, that wasn't, and that I didn't have this sort of umbrella of, oh, I'm doing a great thing by creating art,
Yeah,
which I think many people equate to things like, oh, working for an NGO, just making the world a better place through your work, which I think unfortunately also tends to have this, you should be grateful for the work and therefore we'll pay you less.
exactly.
People who do good for the world don't need to be paid as much, which is frankly bullshit, but whatever, that's a whole other thing. So after a period of time at this company, that the startup was software to allow restaurants to do online ordering. And it's a really incredible startup in that Noah came up with this idea in 2005 when nobody was ordering on their phones, and now like
Right,
everyone's doing
exactly.
it, right? And I was there, my first year was 2009 to 10, so earlier days of smartphones and all of that. And so it was real innovative technology, and we were quite frankly helping put money into the pockets of franchisees and people who are fundamentally running small businesses. But at the time, I was really struggling with, I'm trying to make certain choices with how I eat, where I spend my money, and many of our clients were these sort of fast food or quick service chains, not really
Yeah.
fast food, but
Yeah.
where I was like, I don't necessarily spend my money here. And I don't know how I feel about working at a company that is this, these are our clients. Do I have a funny feeling? And so I was just exploring that. Now it's important to know that Noah, the CEO and founder, is a vegan and has been for years. And his ability to eat at the
Yeah.
restaurants of our clients was pretty limited.
Yeah.
I mean, there was always something he could eat, but and so it was raising questions for me about how much do I need my work, the sort of product that I am putting out into the world, to align with my values. I love this whole working for not working for myself, working for a 9 to 5 type job and having my weekends and having predictable income and all of those things. But
Right.
maybe I miss working in the arts. And I ultimately ended up, a friend of my husband's actually was working at this institution called BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn, which is one of
Oh,
the
cool.
oldest
Yeah.
performing arts
Yep.
institutions in the country. And the name is a little bit of a mystery. That an academy used to be a place of art and
Yeah.
experience, and so that's what the name. But it's a primarily a presenting house, so they have art, dance, and opera and theater from all over the world come and are presented by BAM for a week or two at a time, and sometimes longer. And
Yeah.
then BAM also rents out their spaces as a way to make part of funding the organization. And so this friend worked there and said, "Oh, there's an opening in the general management department. Part of the job is managing logistics of the presenting shows, but also overseeing rentals, events, and managing that." So there's a little bit of a, not so much sales, but it's a bit of a customer success. Like these rental people are customers and they want to have an event, and it's your job to kind of help make sure all the logistics. So it's stage managing, event management, customer success, all of that kind of wrapped into one. And so I said, okay, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll interview. And in hindsight, I was perfect for the job. Like it would have been silly if they hadn't hired me. And so yeah, I ended up working there, and I went in. I've always been pretty ambitious. So I went in with the goal to become assistant general manager. We all reported under the general manager. And I did that for about 4 years. And over the course of my time there, a couple of things happened. One, I got pregnant and had my kid. So that
Right.
was really special. And it was a really special place and time to be working when I was a young parent, just because they were, as much as a nonprofit can be with the resources they have, I think they were pretty supportive of me and my pregnancy. Like I took a good amount of time off. I had to use a lot of my PTO, which is not great. But anyway, I took time off, and then my husband would bring my daughter to work every Wednesday. So like in the middle of the week, I would get this little window of time where she would come into the office, and everyone, of course, loved seeing a baby.
Yeah.
And so we had a nice routine to that where she would pop in and everyone was like, "Oh, it's Annabelle Day." And but the things that I learned in that job were pretty invaluable. One was I realized pretty quickly that if I wanted to work in the arts and truly love it, I needed to be stage managing. And this other stuff was fine, but it wasn't really pushing my buttons in the same way. And two, it really reinforced that I love doing things that had not been done before, the sort
Right.
of
Yeah.
startup. And so while I was pretty good at the budgets and contracts part, that was the core of general management, the projects that I was drawn to were the projects that really involved doing something that we hadn't done before. So while I was there, they opened a new space called the Fisher Building, and I like tried to involve myself in that as much as possible. And we started producing some events. So there was a thing called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry that was like a music festival that had never been done before, and I essentially
Cool.
acted as the assistant producer on that. And so I just really found ways to insert myself
Yeah.
in everything that was interesting to me. And that allowed me to be there for 4 years and learn a ton. And also really, I think, get valuable experience working in an institution with the the people I reported to were people who had been doing this job for years or even decades and who had gone to school for this kind of job, for example.
Yeah.
And while that path isn't for everyone, I do now in hindsight see how deeply valuable it was to work in an environment where there were people like that. Because in contrast, I do also see, I have both in my coaching work and in just in general in the startups I've worked with, I have worked with people who have only worked in startups, and that is a particular environment. And there's plenty of things that are great about that and the agility that you get from that. But I can see for some of them at least, they've missed out on having the experience of watching and learning from seasoned, as in has been around for a while, mentor or just boss, even to the point to say, these are all the things I don't want to do. It's just such a different experience to work for someone like that versus someone who's always, yes, experienced, but really making it up as they go along out of necessity. And so that was a pretty valuable part of that experience for me
Yeah.
as well, being able to work with these seasoned, experienced leaders who were quite, one person in particular, this woman Alice, who was the executive vice president. So she oversaw all the budgets for all of production at BAM. And she just had this budget magic because she's been doing it for so long. And so
Yeah.
she'd say, oh, this is a dance company that has been here a few times. It's an Israeli dance company, and here are the things that we know. And so this we're going to add this much money to like the travel budget because XYZ tends to come up, and you know these things that you can see the value of having
For sure.
time and experience doing this thing that felt very, art can feel very sort of mushy, and she's like putting numbers on paper about that. So she's an incredible person that I loved learning from and working with while I was there.
Yeah.
So that was an important 4 years. And ultimately, a big part of why I decided to leave was that I realized I felt really challenged as a parent to have my work tied to a physical plant, that I needed to be in the building, 5 days a week and sometimes late at night to run events. And I had this young kid, and I just was looking for the opportunity to have more flexibility to be able to work from home sometimes, so that if she was sick or just whatever, I could be there when she came home from school to see her for a half an hour and then go back to work or that kind of thing. So
Right.
it's funny to see all of the conversations about that since COVID, where everyone was home all the time and was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
oh, this isn't so bad. People could actually work remotely, at least in some jobs, and that's fine. And so that was a big factor for me, was looking ahead to the rest of my child's life and going, I don't know that I want to be spending this many hours in a building away from her when I can have a lot of other things I could do that are stimulating to me and my brain and allow me to be a little bit more present as a parent. So that was part of what led me to look to go back in tech again.
Okay. And then moving back into the tech, did you went back to the same company or was it a new startup?
Yeah, it was the same company. It was a funny story. At some point, I I called up Noah. We'd been in touch, and Noah and I would have coffee periodically. And so we were having coffee, and I said, "Look, I think I'm ready to leave, ma'am, and do the next thing. And can you help me out? Introduce me to some people, like who, And we had a frank. I remember this. We had coffee, and he said, "Look, tell me why you really left Olo. I want to help you. So
Yeah.
can we just be straight about this?" Because
Yeah.
at the time I had told him I was missing the arts, which was true, and I wanted to experiment with having a more administrative job in the arts versus stage management. And that was all true, but I hadn't said the part about I have some mixed feelings about the customers that we serve and where that aligns with my values. And we had a very frank, open conversation where he talked about his role as the CEO and a vegan and all of the things that there. And the thing that was pretty powerful that came out of that conversation that we were playing around with and considering was just this idea that you're building a company that is you're creating jobs and opportunities for really interesting, intricate collaboration among a bunch of people who are building a cool software thing.
Yeah.
But two, yes, there are these big companies and all of these things, but in the end, the vast majority of restaurants in under these corporations are franchisees who are people who own 1 to 5 locations and
Yeah.
are everyday Americans just trying to make ends meet and live their lives. And by creating
Yeah.
software that allows them to essentially get more revenue per square foot, you are helping these small businesses thrive, and that's meaningful. And so we had that conversation. I said, that's awesome. And I want to percolate on that. But in the meantime, can you help me with some of these intros? And he was great. And I had a whole bunch of interviews that were super eye-opening that allowed me to realize what a good thing I had working at Olo. Because some of these
Right.
interviews, it was just hilarious. Like at the time, I think I was in my mid-30s. So most of the people I was meeting were younger than me, sometimes by 10 years. And I remember having this interview at one point where the first question someone asked me was very clearly about like what I studied in college.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Let me like go in the Wayback Machine and try to like
Exactly.
find that memory. And so that was just wild. And so at some point after a bit of interviewing, I called Noah one day and I said, hey, so what if I just came back to Olo and he was essentially was some version of I thought you'd never ask.
Yeah.
And by then the company was maybe 35 people. So it hadn't grown crazy over the 4 years, but they had graduated to a place where they had the board had gotten them to get an executive team. So they had a couple, they had a COO and a VP of customer facing roles, basically. So I met the COO and the VP of I think it was called account management at the time, the people that I would report up to, and to make sure that was all good. And that was one of my interesting early lessons and also in salary negotiation, because I did not do enough research to understand what the kind of roles we were talking about were worth in the industry. And at the time, I had been, again, going back to the arts and pay, and the arts is terrible. I was assistant general manager at BAM, and my salary was in the 50s, 50K. And this was in 2014.
Okay.
So it was like 54K maybe. I don't know, but it was not 55, like whenever I was being paid.
Yeah.
And so I was living in New York City and getting paid. And it was like fine, but I'm still like I'm
Juggling
like eating.
artist scenario
Yeah, exactly.
all over
And
the place.
so when I talked about salary with this new boss, we had the salary. I remember we were at a Starbucks and he asked me like what kind of salary I was looking for. And I just did such a poor job that they offered me more than I asked for. It just like it was not even, I just wasn't even close. And I laugh at it now because, but it has those going back to, I think I told you the story of the disastrous photo call that I had and that experience of course, it ended up well for me. They were going to pay you at least this. This is ridiculous what you're asking for. So thankfully, the company had integrity and paid me appropriately for my job. But plenty of people don't. And so that has since then it's become a thing that I actually really get a lot of joy out of doing, which is helping people, especially women and people from otherwise historically marginalized groups, learn how to advocate for themselves in a salary negotiation or any kind of negotiation, because I just didn't know what I was doing and it ended up okay, but it could have been a lot worse.
And I want to touch on this real quick because this is highly valuable for the creative community in looking at what you do, what you're capable of, what your experience is, and being able to recognize the value of you, right? We always undervalue ourselves and provide way more than we end up getting paid for most of the time. And I think that skill set of figuring that out as early as possible so that when you do a project or go into a company to work for them, you have that base in mind so that you don't undervalue yourself. Because a lot of
Mm.
people don't have the scruples that the people that you were working for had and said, we're going to pay you this, but even though you thought you were going to get this and that's what you asked for, we know you're more valuable than that, and we
Mm.
want to pay you what you truly are worth. Most companies will be like, oh, that's all you want? Perfect, done. Start tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because they
exactly.
just saved a ton of money. So I
Yeah.
want, I just wanted to make that clear. Another thing that I'm seeing too is, again, and this goes to truly, I feel, a truly heart-centered CEO who is literally recognizing the value, even though you did leave and you're coming back. And he just wanted to get down to brass tacks with you and said, let's open this up, no guardrails. Tell me what's what. And
Yeah.
even in that, I'm sure in his mindset, I just want you to come back now. But you're looking to go and try these other things out. I'll help you do that. And then you come back and say, hey, could we just pick back where we left off? And he's thought you'd never asked. Having a boss, or for creatives who are in that position of being a boss, to have the mindset to truly care for the people that are working under you is highly essential to the success of the business. And
Mm.
a lot of companies out there today, we see it all over the place, they don't have that mindset. And it becomes a scenario of high turnover, lack of moving things forward, innovation, all of those types of things. And I'm seeing this in your story that you've been valued by these different individuals throughout periods of time that have recognized your skill sets, what you're capable of, what you can do, and have wanted to help flourish that along within you. And I wanted to make that point for the audience so that they can just understand some scenarios of getting paid what you're worth, understanding what you're worth, and then for
Mm.
the business owners, understanding that you need to be a little bit more attentive to the employee in terms of nurturing the fact that they're working for you and want to see your vision move forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things too that's really tricky about if you have, to your point, like if you have a CEO or a founder of a business who gets it and in that they are thinking about from a human perspective, like what does this human bring? What does the business need? What are my strengths as a leader and what are the gaps and how can I hire people who fill in those gaps with their
Yes.
strengths? That is also tricky to scale because one of the things and this is something that I've observed in working with startups, both as an employee and as a consultant who's seen them or coach, seen them from the outside,
Yeah.
that it's we one of the things I've noticed about, and this is sort of true of humans in general, that we tend to assume that everyone sees the world the same way we do. And we can have awareness of that and try to see the world differently. And so if you are a person who has this sort of gut ability to fit people together
Yeah.
to create that a team, and then when it becomes big enough team that other people have to make those decisions, it's sometimes hard to realize that skill you have is a special skill that others don't have. And that being able to start fitting people together in the layers above, below you as the company grows is a skill that needs to either be hired for or taught so that people can, or that you need to figure out how to get your special thing out of your head and into a process that your team can follow. And that's easier said than done for sure. And so that's something that I've seen too is, and what comes back down to that saying that everyone says people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses because
Right.
no matter how great the CEO is, if the person you report directly to is making your life difficult or is just a toxic boss or any and all of the above, then in the end, you're not going to stick through that indefinitely.
Yeah. All right. So with being back in tech, how long did you stay back in that before you decided, you know what, I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to shift into this new thing of having my own business?
Yeah. It was the running my own business was a bit of an accident. It was a
Okay.
COVID
Everybody's accident,
opportunity.
right?
Yes,
Everybody's
yes.
accident to shift.
Yeah. So I worked at Olo for a bit, then I went and worked at another startup as a VP of customer success and moving up the ladder, so to speak. And at that point was also, I think, important in my career was when I joined Chief, which is this private club for executive women. At the time, it was quite small. It was based in New York City. And so we had this like little clubhouse in Tribeca. There were only like 100 or so members. But the original mission behind Chief was to get women into the C-suite and help them stay there. And we could
Okay.
probably have a whole other podcast about the good and the bad and the ugly about Chief. I'm still a member. There's a lot of things that are great about it. But what was amazing, I learned about it, I think, in a New York Times article. And the year that it started, I got my first VP title. And so the minute like the ink was dry, I put my name in and I was like, all right, I want to be in this thing.
Yeah.
And so I was accepted to have a membership and to be a member. And so I got to go to this small, intimate space and meet other women, executive women in New York City. And that really blew my mind in ways that I did not anticipate. I was excited to meet other women and empowerment, woohoo. But I remember they had an event. I don't remember who the speaker was even, But I remember it was this relatively small, intimate space, had a bar and like a room that could fit, I don't know, let's say maybe not even 100 people, probably maybe 50 people on chairs. And maybe it was they had Barbara Corcoran. God, she was amazing. She's such a badass. And
He is very
and so
much.
she,
I love
yeah,
Barbara.
so I walk and I was not late, but I was like not fashionably early for this event. So I walk in, get off the elevator, and I'm in the room. And I remember the bar was over to my left, and this room is just full of people talking, and all of them are women, and all of them are clearly like women with a certain level of experience and expertise. And there's two men, and they're working behind the bar. And I was like, whoa, it just hit me in a way that, particularly working in tech, like I was often the only woman in the room. But if I wasn't, it was because if I was working with a group of engineers, that was most women, most few women. And although there were a decent number of women in certain roles, but we weren't blowing things out of the water
Right.
and my job at the time when I joined Chief, I was at an AI startup. So those tend to be like very engineering heavy, very male heavy. And I was on the executive team, so I was really experiencing that sort of, if we had three women on the executive team, but there was a point where one was out of town and one hadn't joined yet. And so I was in these rooms where it was just men, and the dynamic is just, there's all the things that you read are true about that. It's just, it's tricky. Even the most wonderful men, whatever you want to cut, it's just a tricky dynamic to navigate. And so to be in this space and see all of these women, and to just I remember I had this moment where I was like, all of these women are executives in New York City. And I was like, it just was like wild. And that's like a tiny sliver of all the members that have been through the doors now. And that was definitely a real changing experience. It opened my mind and meaningfully opened my network, because prior to that, all the people in my sort of community were either theater friends from grad school and theater, where when you change a job every 3 4 months, you meet a lot of people and you collect the ones along the way that you want to hang on to. But then I had some friends that I'd made from working at BAM and friends from working at Olo, but these were just a few people, and I hadn't made an effort to really expand my corporate community, for lack of better words. So most of the people I knew my working life recently were men. And suddenly within months, most of the people I was talking to were executive women. Like the majority of my conversations were, which was a huge change. And I was meeting all these new people, all these different backgrounds, people who are general counsel, COO of a giant company, salesperson, just all these different people from different backgrounds. And so when I left my job, the VP role, and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next in early 2020, I got a job offer, or I'd said yes to a job that was a company based in Europe that was expanding its operations in the US. And I was going to lead the sort of New York piece to then New York customer success to expand to the rest of the US. And I was supposed to start on March 23rd, 2020 was supposed to be my first day.
Okay.
You remember the dates of all that? Like New
Yep.
York shut down, I think on March 16th or around then, or 13th.
Yeah.
And the way this company worked, we were supposed to, onboarding was usually, they had launched in 15 countries in Europe already. So they had this whole process where you would go to France for 2 weeks for onboarding, and then the expansion team would come to your country for 3 months and build out things and then you were on your way.
Yeah.
And so immediately both of those things were not possible. And so they said, okay, we're going to pause and see how this all shakes out. And so I'm collecting unemployment, and that which expanded in New York meaningfully in a way that was useful. My kid is remote learning in first grade, whatever that is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
God bless her first grade teacher was amazing. He was basically Mr. Rogers, and I just one of the most wonderful humans ever, and really did a fantastic job. But still, it was like a shitty situation.
Yeah.
And so we went through that, and so it was actually I felt quite lucky that I didn't have a job at the time, because I don't, the people who were juggling two corporate jobs and two parents in the same house with multiple kids, I don't know how they
Mhm.
survived. But this job kept getting delayed. And as it was delayed, I was watching how their values translated to action, or at least their spoken values translated to action in the context of COVID. And I was not impressed. And I started to feel like, I don't think I want to work at this company. And it was a company it was a for-profit company, but they were doing a meaningful work and really changing some things that were going to impact the environment in a positive way. That was like their whole mission. And so I was really excited to work for this mission driven for-profit company, but just their creative outside the box thinking for was not okay. Now we have to figure out how to launch a country remotely. We've never done this before, but let's do it. They were trying to think around what are the loopholes so we can fly people to XYZ and
Oh,
do
wow.
things anyway.
Yeah.
And when I said I'm not going to go to France in July of 2020, whatever it was, yeah, 2020, which like they were okay, we can work around it. We'll onboard you remotely while everybody else comes. And I was like, no one's going to France. And sure enough, in 2 days, they were like, no Americans are coming here. Are you kidding me?
Exactly.
And so it was just, it felt like they were not living in reality and not adapting to the world in a way that was human centered, despite what their values were. And
Yeah.
so I also got bored and I started feeling like I wanted to use my brain. And because I was a member of Chief, we had at the time that we were using Slack. So there were people on Slack just asking for help, saying, "Oh, have you run this before? What's?" And so I I need to use my brain. So I got to a point where in the summer of 2020, basically anytime someone posted anything on that Slack saying, "Does anyone know how to do this? Or has anyone done this? Or anyone have an idea how to do X?" I would say, "I'll get on a call with you." So it's like, please use my brain. Please talk to me about business things,
Yeah.
and we'll talk through it. And so one of those one of those women, I think, in the real true spirit of what Chief was intended to do, basically helped me let her hire me to do my first consulting gig, to be
Nice.
on the phone talking about professionalizing her customer support team. And she had posted some questions, issues she was struggling with. And so I said, "Oh, I'm happy to help with this." And so we talked for maybe 30 minutes. And near the end of the call, she goes, "So as a consultant, do you work for yourself or for a company?" And at that, like I had told her the whole story that I had
Yeah.
this job that was like supposed to start in 6 weeks and I didn't know it was going. And so I was like, "I work for myself." And she was like, "Great. And could you put together a proposal for how you could help us for maybe 6 weeks? I know you have some limitations in the next 6 weeks, how you could help us solve these problems. And maybe get that to me on Monday." And I was like, "Yes, I could. Sure. Yes, I can do that." She's like, "Great, great." And so I was like, "Okay." And I put together a proposal and asked for what I thought was a lot of money. And she said, "That sounds completely reasonable." And I was like, "Yes, totally does. Sounds completely reasonable." And so that she was my first client. And it was then within a week or two, I went, "Oh, I can be paid this much to do this." It was just the
Mhm.
reality of what it means to go back to some of the things we were talking about the early, like being able to lean into your strengths and do something that is easy for you, but it's so valuable to somebody else. Like there's this quote somewhere, I don't know who this came from, but it's something like, "What is easy to you is amazing to someone else." And so I was doing this work that felt fun and relatively easy to me. And their minds were blown. They were like, "This is so helpful. This is so amazing." And so that was fun to be delivering something valuable. And so I went, "Well, okay." And so I told the company that had hired me, because they were ramping up to finally get started. And we had a few more conversations that were just like, for me, like I was talking about expectations for people and in the customer success. Like if I were hiring a customer success team, that I would expect them to be fully remote unless something required them to go on site and be at a restaurant or whatever to sort things out. And the person I was talking to said, what does that look like to you? Maybe one or like maybe 3 or 4 days in the office and 1 or 2 days at home. And I was like, "No." Like it was just very clear that they had this expectation of people just working in an office, not like COVID. This was July, August of 2020. And I was like, I'm not gonna,
Oh,
I have
wow. Yeah.
I have an octogenarian in-laws that we visit at least once a week to try to make sure that they're okay. Or maybe we weren't, but my husband was visiting them. So like, we don't know how to, I don't think there were any vaccines yet. There was none of that. And they were just
Right.
like, "We're going to just do this thing." And so I told them that I had found that I loved consulting and wanted to do that instead, which was partially true, but was really like, there's no way in hell I'm going to work in this environment.
Yeah.
And so that was the beginning of my working for myself adventure. It's by accident, but a like happy accident, as Bob Ross likes to say.
Exactly. Exactly. And how did you come up with the name Nimble Penguin?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, that was actually after I had that first client. It took a lot of work, and I actually I hired a coach, a business founder consultant coach person, to help me turn people pay me for this thing sometimes to I have a business and this is what it's called and this is what I do. I knew I could do that on my own, but I felt like this is going to be so much better if I have this person who knows what she's talking about help me sort through all this. And so she helped me do some exercises to figure out the name. I had 27. I had an Evernote doc, I think, that I've been like dumping a bunch of names. And my brother had a friend who does like branding and naming and he's a very artistic person and I think was working for a company that helped people name things like even drugs and stuff like that. And so we had a call and played around with some ideas. But in the end, what it came down to for me was there were two key two key things that I wanted to focus on. One was this idea of loyalty, because I felt like a lot of the work I was doing was that at the root of loyalty in customers and loyalty in employees. If you want to build a successful business, you need loyal employees and loyal customers.
Yeah.
And so loyalty was at the heart. And then the idea, the sort of principle idea, what I'm going to call it, that I have come to believe is quite true about humans, which is that if you help people find or create the environment where they can truly thrive, then that's how if they're your employees, how they deliver the best results and build the most innovative products and build the best companies, the most successful companies.
Yeah.
And so with those two ideas, I started playing around. I wanted an animal. And so when the idea of loyalty, I think of Morgan Freeman, March of the Penguins, and like these penguins who are they mate for life and individually, but also as a group. The female penguins all go off and hunt together, and the male penguins all are huddling around each other to protect the eggs. There's all of this. There's so much loyalty and support and connection.
Yeah.
So penguins felt yes, and then the sort of nimble piece came in there, because when you think about penguins, we usually think of the like funny little like
Right.
waddle, which
Yeah.
does not like sound like nimble, right? But if you, on the flip side, if you put a penguin in the ocean, they're actually one of the most agile swimmers out there. And
Right.
so it really connected for me with the idea of when you help people find the environment where they can thrive, that they can do amazing things. And so penguins are silly waddlers, but when they're in the ocean, they can swim in amazing ways. And so hence the nimble penguin
Yeah. When they're in their
name was given.
natural space, they can excel.
Yeah, yeah,
Very
yeah.
cool. Very cool. And just to give a brief explanation of exactly what Nimble Penguin does for others and what you work with others and help them figure out, what does that entail?
Yeah, so my business is coaching advisory, and I'm a community host, and I think of it host and guide, and my primary clients tend to be founders, executives, or what I think of as emerging leaders, so folks who are on that path to executive leadership. And when I think about how I talk about myself and the work that I do, I've come to call myself an empowerment instigator.
Yeah.
And to me, that means that I find great joy in helping innovative high performers become the most impactful leaders they know. And so my clients tend to be what I think of as trailblazers and disruptors who
Yeah.
strive to learn and grow and advance their careers and lives. And they often look at business or even the world differently than others. They might be the only person in the room who sees a particular challenge or solution from their perspective. And these are folks who want to know how to better advance. My clients tend to be trailblazers and disruptors who strive to learn and grow and advance in their careers and their lives. And they often look at the business or even the world differently than others. And they might be the only person in the room who sees a particular challenge or solution from their perspective. And they often want to know how to better advance their ideas and create change in the organizations in the world. And that, as you know from my story, that I tend to say to people, I'm a former professional stage manager turned customer success executive turned executive and leadership coach. And I have the thread throughout my work and my story that has allowed me to pull all those things together. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I do and today and who I am.
It's an amazing story. And I truly appreciate you being willing to come on and share your life with everybody else so that I truly believe they'll be able to gain something from it. And I feel that with most guests that I have, there's always different pieces that come out that will benefit the creative community and artists. And because When you say creative, it's so broad. There's so many different facets of being creative in the world, whether it's a chef, a hairstylist, makeup artist, a painter, musician, what have you. It's very broad. And my hope is to be able to have these stories, give perspective, let people know that they're not alone, that there is a sense of community that can be built through communication. And that's part of what I'm trying to do. And I know you're doing that with your community in terms of the executives and that type of thing. So I truly appreciate you coming on. And I just want to leave the audience with one last statement, and I end it this way every episode, and it is be true to your heart and always be kind to your mind.